Welcome to The Market That Moves America, a podcast from the National Center for the Middle Market. The center is the leading source of knowledge, leadership, and innovative research on the middle market economy. Throughout our podcast, we will feature middle market leaders and stakeholders to hear their real-world perspectives on trends and emerging issues.
Welcome to the Market That Moves America podcast, where today's episode features a discussion with Jackie Benson, Wells Fargo economist supporting commercial banking. My name is Doug Farren, Executive Director of the National Center for the Middle Market, located at The Ohio State University Fisher College of Business. And excited about today's episode. We're going to discuss some of the findings of our latest middle market indicator report and how those insights on U.S. middle market companies stack up against some of the broader economic data that Jackie and her colleagues track within the bank. So, Jackie, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
So, we always start with just our guests telling us, a little bit about yourself, your background, and your current role with Wells Fargo.
So I'm an economist with Wells Fargo. What that means is that we're basically researchers and we analyze all of the economic data that comes in on a daily basis. So you can think about consumer spending, business investment, construction. We keep a very close eye on that. And we write a lot of reports discussing those trends. And we also produce a forecast about where we see things headed over the next few years. But a little bit about my background. I was born and raised in Florida, and then I spent 7 years working in Washington, D.C. Now I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is great, except for the snowstorm we just had. Not a fan of that.
Yeah, I think we're all kind of done with winter in most parts of the country. How big is the team that you work on? Is it a fairly large group of economists? Or
it's about 14 to 15 people. We're split between New York and Charlotte.
Okay, got it. So I guess my first question, you've seen some of the data that we track. So the middle market indicator now, we're 14 full years of tracking several different things from mid-sized companies. We kind of look at some of their performance from a revenue and employment growth rate. We look at some of the challenges and confidence and, where they're investing capital. And then obviously some of the, current issues like AI, talent, tariffs, and so forth. How does that stack up against maybe some of the broader economic data that you look at?
So I reviewed kind of the results of the survey, and a lot of it was spot on with the broader national trends we're seeing. It seems as if companies were fairly constructive on their growth outlooks from a revenue standpoint. And when you look at the broader economy, the equivalent there is really GDP growth. It's how fast domestic economic outlook increases. When GDP growth is higher, it means businesses are hiring and investing and consumers are spending, et cetera. And what we've seen is surprisingly strong economic growth, kind of starting in Q2 of this year. Of course, we don't expect that to stay at the same pace, but, despite all of the headwinds that you've heard, tariffs being maybe the largest, that hasn't dealt a huge blow to economic growth, which is a good thing. So from that perspective, the data aligns. It's spot on.
Yeah, so it kind of goes against what was expected, right? Like these shocks and uncertainty and headwinds really would have created a projection of a more muted growth environment, but it sounds like that hasn't been the case.
That's true, but what I would argue is that growth has been resilient despite these headwinds, not because of them. So even though we have extraordinarily high tariffs, there's no longer a huge increase of them rising substantially in our view, and businesses were able to mitigate a lot of those challenges. Economy-wide profit margins are elevated and businesses took on those tariff costs themselves as opposed to passing them on completely to their customers.
Right. Got it. So you mentioned in the intro that your team produces reports that help support the commercial bank team. Can you give us maybe a little detail on that, what that looks like, or maybe some insights, and how the bankers then use that information as they're having discussions with their middle market clients and prospects?
So, yeah, I mean, both internal bankers and clients of Wells Fargo, they're always interested in our outlook and our expectation for consumer spending, for construction, for investment. More than anything, I find they're interested in our rate outlook, so where we think interest rates are going. And every month we publish a broad economic outlook with an interest rate forecast included. Just for curiosity's sake, if you're interested, we're currently expecting 2 rate cuts this year for a total of 50 basis points by June. So that would bring the Federal Reserve's interest rate from its current level of 3.75% down to 3.25%. And we think the balance of risks is pretty fair on both sides for that expectation.
And that would be the lowest rate since when? Pre-pandemic?
So interest rates did start rising in 2019 before the pandemic, but they were at zero for so long, after we had that global shock. So it's not quite back down to zero, but it's more or less 3.25 by our view is more or less in line with the neutral interest rate, which is a fancy economic term that basically means an interest rate that neither discourages nor encourages economic activity.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's interesting. I mentioned we launched in 2011, and then we've been tracking this indicator data since the spring of 2012. And so we've got this very, big longitudinal data set. And I wanted to ask you why, having that trend data is so important when you can look back for things like, certain patterns or understanding where there have been shocks and then what that has meant. Kind of, tell us a little bit about how you think about that in terms of like historical and or trend information.
Now you're getting nerdy, so I love it. So as an economist, specifically a macroeconomist, I love time series. And the more time series, the better, because context is everything. A, you need a good time series in order to run proper analysis. B, you need a good time series in order to distinguish signal from noise. So it's a good way to gauge whether a particular variable is largely outside of its norm, or if it's kind of just wiggling around like macro variables tend to do. Without a long history, you really don't have much to go on. So I'd argue it's necessary.
Right. Yeah, now that aligns well with our views as well. So let's talk a little bit about some of our latest results. We just released our year-end middle market indicator, and we were our last version in the summer, our mid-year report. We definitely saw more muted growth results. Both revenue growth and employment growth across the middle market were down, several percentage points from where they had been trending over the last 3 to 4 years. So we attributed that to, basically talking to owners and CEOs. They're just telling us that there's just so much uncertainty out there. We can't plan effectively. We don't know where our costs are headed. We haven't made a decision about whether we're going to pass these costs on or we're going to eat them, and supply chains are all messy. So fortunately, we saw that bounce back a bit here at the year end growth, from a top end over 10%, although hiring's still a little bit muted. And I think I just saw a jobs report recently, maybe earlier this week, where, layoffs are kind of at their highest in a long time. So what are you kind of seeing from the national perspective in terms of U.S. economic performance here as we are at the start of the year?
So there's a lot of dichotomies going on. I started out talking about how resilient economic growth has been. A lot of that can be attributed to AI and the data center build out and these forces that kind of mask the underlying dynamics for maybe smaller, medium-sized firms. When it comes to hiring, the labor market has crawled. It slowed to a crawl. We had hiring, if you look at like a monthly average at the first quarter of 2025, the U.S. economy was adding 100,000 or more jobs per month. Now, if you kind of strip out volatility associated with the federal government, we're about 20 or 30,000 jobs per month. And that's even weaker when compared to before the pandemic, when we were about 160,000 or so. So what you have is companies with firm growth happening from like a capital expenditure standpoint related to high tech, and yet they're not hiring. And how you explain that, because that's very abnormal. Usually you have strong economic growth and strong hiring along with it. How you explain that is increased labor productivity. So labor productivity this cycle since the pandemic is, pretty higher than it was during the last cycle. Not quite at the level of kind of the dot-com innovation in the early 2000s, but it's certainly increased on balance.
Are there any is there an impact from the labor pool itself in terms of the demographics, right? Like participation. I think one thing that we've heard, just in conversations, there are a lot of baby boomers who are getting ready to retire or are retiring. Clearly we've got some policy things going on with the government as well, but does that contribute to this issue too? Just the pool of labor that's available?
It does. So I'd say our current labor market challenges are both on the supply and the demand side. So I talked about the demand side a little bit. You have higher costs from tariffs and just inflation kind of causing businesses to think twice about adding more payroll. And then on the supply side, you have pretty stagnant labor force growth. Labor force, depending on the measure, is essentially flat, not growing anymore. And that is partly driven by aging population and retiring baby boomers. It's also driven by slower foreign-born workers, entry of foreign-born workers to the labor force. And in a lot of places, you see a net decline in foreign-born workers. So it's actually a drag on labor supply. So it kind of depends on who you talk to. Some businesses have job openings they can't fill because they can't find the workers, especially in construction and manufacturing. Some businesses are reducing hiring from their standpoint to reduce costs.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about kind of expansionary plans, because one of the things we ask our middle market survey respondents is on some of the steps they take to drive the growth of the business. And usually what we see at the top of that list would be things like introducing new products or services, or thinking about expanding into new, primarily for the middle market, it's domestic expansion, much less so international expansion. And then things like adding facilities, right? Like warehouses, data centers, all those types of things. And then you mentioned, the expectations around rate cuts and maybe more favorable rates. But what does all that say about the capital demands and credit and things that are going to help support? Because these businesses need the funding to drive those activities, right? What do you see from that standpoint?
So there's a lot there. There's a lot to talk about. First, just from an uncertainty standpoint, uncertainty is still elevated. Whether that is due to domestic policy changes, things like trade and immigration, or due to geopolitical tensions, which is certainly on display right now, overall uncertainty is a factor kind of suppressing investment. Also, you have just higher interest rates. Yes, they've come down and we expect them to come down more. But when you talk about warehouses and commercial real estate, that was one of the hardest hit sectors from the Fed's monetary tightening. And basically what you saw is CRE construction kind of boomed coming out of the pandemic when interest rates were zero. And then when interest rates started rising, new construction starts plummeted. So they're no longer falling, but they're much weaker than they have been. And that's, a big component into investment.
Okay. I do want to touch on, you mentioned AI and technology in general. It's such a huge theme right now across all the business landscape. And, one of the things that we're hearing pretty consistently is business leaders saying, yeah, this is here. It's here to stay. Like, I know I need to think about it and how I can implement it. But a lot of times they don't know how to necessarily measure it in terms of, is it successful? What kind of ROI am I getting? You mentioned labor productivity. Like, okay, if I'm going to replace people with AI, what does that mean from a productivity standpoint and cost to my business? So what are you seeing like across just the technology or even more specifically like AI landscape?
So firstly, there has been a shift in business investment. Before the pandemic, you had the percentage of business fixed investment going to high tech categories like semiconductors or telecommunications equipment, computers, et cetera. That percentage was, around 40%, maybe a little higher. After the pandemic, now it's over 60%. So it's actually overtaken your traditional investment categories of like property, plant, equipment. I'd say that's because AI is viewed as a very safe bet right now from an investment standpoint and as a growth area. In terms of measuring productivity, so I said, yes, we have higher productivity this cycle, and a lot of people are quick to attribute that to AI. It's too early to be able to causally establish that. But I'm sure that these, technological advancements are having some positive productivity effects, just talking to people in their day-to-day work. How do you measure productivity? Like as a business owner, that's hard. I'm not a business owner. I'm a researcher. What I would say is output per hour or output per worker. Like that's the formula for productivity. So that's how I would measure it.
Yeah. Many of them tell us like they think about tasks that are just very repetitive and that people hate doing. And that's where they're starting with their AI implementation, which makes a ton of sense. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit with tariffs and trade. So that, you mentioned at the beginning, that was the big shock from last year where, companies were kind of hit with this, the policy changes that they had to kind of think about and adapt to. We saw it kind of, cool down a bit, I would say, toward the end of the year. But, what are some of the big things that companies should be looking out for in 2026 when it comes to tariffs?
So, of course, we can't predict the future. And tariffs are an area that the administration has a lot of like singular control over. You don't need Congress. So because of that, it's almost impossible to predict where they're going to go. That said, our house view is that the current tariff level is likely going to stay where it's at or even come down a little bit. And that's because of a few reasons. First, the administration, the president, has been vocal about affordability, prioritizing affordability. You've seen that with some of the housing policy announcements that he made, but it's kind of across the board. Affordability is a focal point. Along with that, they did roll back some tariffs on consumer goods and groceries, for example. Mm-hmm. So that's an example, probably not willing to raise them too much further, right. And stoke inflation. And then also you have a Supreme Court case, which we should have a decision any day now. I'd expect it within the next month, but it'll certainly be in the first half of this year. And if the Supreme Court rules that these emergency tariffs are illegal, that would, I wouldn't say it's going to bring the tariff rate down because there's other legal mechanisms that the administration can use to bring it right back up. And I'm sure they would. But it gives more kind of evidence that tariffs probably aren't going to move drastically higher than they are today. Now, I'm not disregarding tariff threats on Canada and these countries, and that's going to be a source of volatility and uncertainty for some time. Just our base case is that the current tariff rate is probably where it's going to stay. Okay,
great. So as we wrap up here, my last kind of question I wanted to put out there for you was, with all this information, like I think sometimes people just get overwhelmed with information. And as we go through the balance of this year, for businesses in particular, What do you think some of the key things that they should kind of keep their eye on? Whether it's, rate cuts, certainly that'll be important, but what are some of the, big takeaways for our audience to think about in terms of things they really need to be paying attention to that might, most drastically impact their business or some of the decision making they need to make?
So interest rates are a big one. And especially since we are going to have a new Fed chair, whose first meeting will be in June. Kevin Warsh is going to be replacing Jerome Powell. So I definitely keep an eye on that. And then along with that, first I'll answer from like an economist perspective. The main star in econ world really is the labor market right now, because it is changing and it is, is it going to stabilize or is it going to weaken further? Is it going to improve? And that's really the topic I think that deserves a lot of attention alongside inflation. How sticky will inflation be? We think it's going to be pretty firm, but kind of in the second half of this year, it can start coming down a little bit after these tariff pass-through is fully worked into the economy. So those are the main ones from my standpoint, but of course I'm not a business owner. I think credit conditions are going to evolve, and that's something to keep an eye on as well.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, I know I certainly learned a lot. This was interesting for me personally, but I think our audiences are going to get quite a bit out of this. So I appreciate your time and sharing these insights with us today.
Yes, it was an absolute pleasure, and I hope this was informative, if not entertaining.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks, everybody. For more information, if you want to access our middle market indicator data, you can visit our site, middlemarketcenter.org, and we will talk to you again soon. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to The Market That Moves America. Never miss a new episode by subscribing anywhere podcasts can be found. You can also subscribe to our email newsletter at middlemarketcenter.org.